Within Steven Spielberg's filmography, you have the all-time classics, along with some of his popular blockbusters and the highly recognized historical dramas. However, he also has a few movies that don't get the same level of adoration and attention, and probably one of his most infamous, less talked about films is 1941. As the movie Spielberg made directly after hitting it big with Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, there was a lot of pressure on this World War II set comedy. However, it turned out to be a massive disappointment, with both critics and audiences largely greeting it with a shrug. While it has grown a bit of a cult following since then, 1941 is still a movie often placed low on several Spielberg rankings. I personally find it to be a solid film, although I also understand the criticisms thrown at it since its release in 1979. The first time I watched 1941 was catching a showing of the movie on Turner Classic Movies in 2009 at around 2 o'clock in the morning. That's right, I saw it was going to be showing those early morning hours, and being one of the last few Spielberg films I'd yet to see at that point, I set my alarm and switched on the television, not entirely knowing what to expect. During the first act of the movie, I struggled with it and found it disappointing and disorienting. At a certain point, though, I got more into the groove of what Spielberg was doing and came away with a positive view of 1941. Not a movie I necessarily loved like a lot of other Spielberg projects, but I nonetheless felt there was a decent amount to appreciate. Watching again years later, I still like 1941, but did feel about the same about its strengths and weaknesses as I did the first time. I do think those first 30 or so minutes are rough, as it tries really hard to introduce all these characters, and the gags cannot quite stick the landing. Whether it's the fault of the jokes written by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, or Spielberg's execution, it's just not all that funny. There are a few amusing slapstick gags, but there's also a lot of material that just lies there. Eventually, 1941 does find its footing as the jokes not only get a little bit better, but Spielberg goes all in with the massive set pieces. That's what the movie most excels at. These are some terrific set pieces that are brilliantly mounted and put together by Spielberg and the special effects team. A particular highlight comes from a dance number at a USO show. The choreography is so clever and inventive, with the camera finding the perfect angles to show the dancing. While the beginning of the movie can feel a little sluggish, this is when it finally comes alive. The sequence even shows the seeds being planted for what Spielberg would accomplish several decades later with West Side Story. From then on, it goes all out with depicting the battle and action sequences. Another highlight, maybe the funniest scene in 1941, is the complete destruction that Ned Beatty's character causes to his own house. It's an example of one of the film's themes about the heightened paranoia over some potential foreign invader then harming people at home. In every scene, Spielberg is destroying and blowing things up, and you can just imagine him cackling behind the camera. It's worth remembering that one of the earliest movie scenes that left an impression on a young Steven Spielberg was the train crash in Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth, which he later recreated at home with a film camera and some model trains. So with 1941, he was basically living his childhood dream of doing that on a massive scale over and over again. The story really was just an excuse to string these sequences together and see how crazy things get. Of the massive cast, I think the standout is Robert Stack, who plays real-life Major General Joseph Stilwell. He has a particularly good moment where he takes in a screening of Dumbo and gets very invested in the escapades of that flying elephant. It's not the first and last time Spielberg has paid homage to animation in his movies, but it really shows his affection for the art form. One of the comedic high points is a scene of Slim Pickens being interrogated by the Japanese, and we see his determination to make sure he does not tell them anything. There's also Toshio Mifune as the Japanese submarine commander, and Christopher Lee as the Nazi captain tagging along, and there is something funny about the two of them getting on each other's nerves. Murray Hamilton does well as a man forced to keep watch on a Ferris wheel, and he has to deal with Eddie Deason and his ventriloquist dummy. And let's be honest, I think a lot of us will get annoyed having to listen to Mandark for several hours. Although there are some jokes that I don't think quite work. A lot of John Belushi's screen time as a drunken pilot largely involves the same joke of him acting drunk and shooting his gun off, and I don't find too much amusement in his antics. There's also a running gag involving Nancy Allen as Stilwell's secretary, who gets aroused whenever she flies in an airplane. Maybe it could have worked under the right execution, but I just found the whole thing odd and fell flat. Back to one of the positives, John Williams composed an excellent score for 1941, with the main march being a wonderful and memorable tune, perfectly fitting the patriotic nature of the characters. I can easily imagine an army band playing the main theme, as it works both as a comedic piece and as a triumphant march. And for the dance hall sequence, Williams wrote a composition heavily inspired by the iconic 1930s big band piece Sing 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 with a Swing. One of his earliest musical gigs was arranging music for the US Air Force Band in the 50s, so he really tapped into his own history when composing the score for 1941. Even with these many characters we have to follow throughout the movie and the film jumping back and forth between the various participants, I do think we eventually get to know them and the individual roles they played in these loosely connected plot threads. At the end of the movie, when we see several of them together looking at everything they accomplished, or sometimes did not accomplish, I do think it all comes to a satisfying conclusion. Here's the thing with 1941, though. This is a movie that could only be made by a director of a lot of hubris. Spielberg himself has admitted that following the success of his previous two films, he had developed a big ego. He felt he was unstoppable and anything he made would end up a big crowd pleaser. That's why this movie goes for broke for the entire runtime, and Spielberg even directed the scenes that would normally be handled by a second unit crew. The movie literally begins with a scene parroting Jaws. Imagine being so confident that you open your big budget comedy by spoofing your incredibly popular blockbuster hit from 4 years earlier. Universal and Columbia Pictures would team up to release this movie, with Universal handling the film's American release and Columbia taking international rights, and they were probably happy to foot the bill. Columbia was grateful to Spielberg for helping the studio's financial difficulties with the success of Close Encounters, and Universal likely saw this as the next Animal House. However, 1941 was torn apart by critics who found the movie loud, obnoxious, and not all that funny. And honestly, even as someone who appreciates the movie, I can see where they're coming from. There's a lot to take in, and it just pummels you with the explosions, battles, and the constant noise. And I've only watched this on a television. Imagine seeing this in theaters on a massive screen and with Dolby surround sound. Spielberg will later comment that test audiences put their hands over their ears from the sensory overload of it all. Again, I really admire the chutzpah of these set pieces, but they are a lot, especially as they pile up. 1941 is one of those movies where you get swept up in the craziness of it all, or you don't. The film is often referred to as a flop, but it actually did turn a profit, although it interestingly saw a bigger gross internationally than it did at the domestic box office. It was just being compared to the grosses of Jaws and Close Encounters. And several years later, Animaniacs did a joke where the Warner siblings drop a bunch of movie bombs in the form of video cassettes, and one of them is 1941. Spielberg himself approved that joke, so I guess he's not too bothered by that movie being labeled as such. The response to 1941 did humble him a bit, and it made him reflect that maybe let his success up to that point get to his head. It was nobly the third film in a row he directed that went over schedule and over budget, and he thus made a promise to himself that he would try to avoid that on his movies from then on. Spielberg even hired Frank Marshall to produce Raiders of the Lost Ark because he had primarily worked on independent productions and Peter Bogdanovich movies, and he wanted to have someone on set who would keep him in check. And it worked. Since Raiders, the only Spielberg movie to go over budget and schedule has been Hook. Although it is interesting he followed 1941 with Raiders of the Lost Ark, because they do share a certain kinship. That's also a movie set during a period of growing concerns about the rise of fascism, is about an American hero trying to stop this foreign force from destroying civilization as he knows it, largely consists of wall-to-wall action sequences, and puts the main character in a lot of comical situations involving his fight skills and gunplay. There are even Nazis depicted as somewhat inept villains, not unlike Christopher Lee's Captain in 1941. One joke originally intended for 1941 ended up in Raiders instead. There was a gag where Lee appeared to be holding a torch weapon, but it's instead revealed to be a coat hanger. It got a silent reaction from test audiences, so Spielberg disappointingly cut that joke. However, he gave it another go in Raiders, and it stayed in the final film. It seemed like he took what he learned maybe did not perfectly work in his previous film, and then sort of tweaked it to create something where the action, characters, and story landed better with viewers. It really is an example of how execution is everything, and it probably also helped that Raiders was juggling a lot less characters and storylines. Nonetheless, I think 1941 has a lot to offer as a sheer spectacle, and Spielberg does seem to be inserting a lot of his love for World War II movies here. He wanted to create something silly and bonkers, while also giving the audience something worthy of the big screen. I mean, you can certainly see all the money spent on the production. The finished film is just maybe a little too chaotic, and there are some parts where the jokes don't quite hit. I do wonder what the movie might have been like if a different director had made it. These sorts of wacky comedy bits and exaggerated gags might have made this a more fitting project for a director like Joe Dante or John Landis or Abram Zucker. I feel like Dante would have gone for something very much inspired by classic Looney Tunes World War II cartoons, while mixing that with the fear felt during wartime. Landis would have gone heavy on the spectacle and maybe done more risque jokes, while the Zaz team would put a heavier emphasis on visual gags and wordplay. It's interesting thinking about these alternate scenarios, but I nonetheless like what Steven Spielberg put together here. See you next time.